Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Tonight we're starting Ecclesiastes. I thought briefly about having Ecclesiastes, Nietzsche, or Camus here on the board, but I decided not to. Those would be existentialist philosophers. But we're not going to do that. But Ecclesiastes is an interesting book of the Bible, as we'll see when we get into it. Some people find it depressing.
Some people misinterpret it.
Well, no, it can be depressing.
I mean, the ones who don't think it's depressing.
It sort of stands in juxtaposition. It says over against, say, the book of Proverbs that we just finished. The book of Proverbs that we read is wisdom, and it's overall, I mean, if you're a fool or if you're ungodly or something, it's kind of negative towards you. But on the whole, it's sort of positive, right? We talked about how, it talks about there's two roads you could travel, and it's about helping you take the right road, right? It's about advising you and helping you. So, Ecclesiastes sort of takes the flip side of that perspective. Ecclesiastes is sort of written about the wrong road and why it's the wrong road. Right? Ecclesiastes is called in the original after the person who's speaking. The person who's writing it refers to himself in the original as Kohelet. That's what that looks like in Aramaic lettering. Sorry about that. That's how it's usually translated in English, or transliterated in English. Qohelet. Kohelet. And it's Q because I'm not an expert on Arabic, but at least in Aramaic lettering, there are 6 letters that make the sound in various different ways. This one is kind of it's sort of the back of your throat. And so that's usually transliterated as a Q. Kohelet means teacher or instructor. When the time came to translate this into Greek, for the Septuagint, they translated this as Ecclesiastes, which would be a person who instructs. You can see the root there, ecclesia, that we usually translate church. It really means the assembly or gathering of the people. So the Ecclesiastes would be a person who teaches the people, right? Who teaches the gathered group. So sometimes it's translated by people as preacher to try to get that aspect, like you have the assembled people and he's teaching them. So the teacher or the preacher. Now traditionally also, it's a sign that King Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes. Now, it doesn't come straight out and say, nowhere in there does it say, "Hi, I'm King Solomon, I'm writing this," right? Or even in Proverbs where we get headings, with the wisdom of Solomon, right? In a couple places in the book, the author, the teacher, identifies himself as the son of David, the king of Israel, okay, that he's writing as. And as we'll see, part of the whole perspective of the book is that he's writing about sort of having had it all, having lost it all. Right? And so, perspective-wise, that fits well with Solomon. Right? That fits well with King Solomon. You talk about a king who had it all and lost it all. Right? And also, this is obviously wisdom literature with which King Solomon is associated. We're also going to see he's associated with the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon that we're going to read next, and also, of course, with the Wisdom of Solomon. Now, the Orthodox Study Bible presents this as very clear-cut. It's not quite so clear-cut. Like they have it there when they think he wrote it. Right? They say, he probably wrote it around 935 BC. There are some problems with that. The biggest ones are, there are about 3 Persian words in various parts of the book of Ecclesiastes. Persian language didn't exist at the time of King Solomon. Obviously, we know that later in history, people of Israel were in exile under the Persian Empire, when surely they could have picked up some Persian words, right? So that and other things in the text tell us that the text as we have it now is from a much later date than that. Now that doesn't mean Solomon didn't write it. Okay? This is, you'll see if, not that they've ever done one to my knowledge, but if the History Channel ever did a special on Ecclesiastes, right? It's not sort of one of those big ticket books like Genesis, but if they ever did a special on Ecclesiastes, they would use things like the 3 Persian words. So obviously Solomon didn't write it. This is a forgery written later, right? And make this big deal out of it. Right? But as we've seen before with other books, it's not an either or, right? Like we talked about the fact that none of the languages that we have the first 5 books of the Bible in, even Hebrew, take those as one, right? Even Hebrew didn't exist at the time Moses was alive, right? So we talked about how the fact that we believe that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible doesn't mean he wrote exactly what we now, 3,200 years later, have in our hands. But that what we now, 3,200 years later, have in our hands originated with Moses, right? And that it was passed on. It's not a problem for us, because everything we receive in the church has been passed on for generations and generations and generations, right? And we believe that God, the Holy Spirit, has been guiding that process of handing down these books, translating them into new languages, right? To make sure that what we have today is what He wants us to have today, right? What we receive now in the church is what He wants us to have. Okay? So He doesn't want us to have the original tablets that Moses would have, used to read and put the marks on. He wanted us to have the first 5 books of the Bible as we have them now. Right? So we can say the same thing very easily about Ecclesiastes. When we're saying this, that the book of Ecclesiastes is a book of Solomon, we're not necessarily saying that what we have here today is exactly what Solomon would have sat and written down. Right? As we saw with the book of Proverbs, Solomon didn't necessarily sit and write it down. Right? Other people, in the case of Proverbs, collected what Solomon had said and wrote it down and put it together into books. Right? So what we're saying when we affirm that Solomon is behind the book of Ecclesiastes is that what we now have originated with the historical person of King Solomon. Right? And what we now have is that book is put together, is collected, is translated, as the Holy Spirit has brought it to us today. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's not an either or.
Well,
Yeah.
I know you said this before, but when exactly was the Bible, the Old Testament, translated? Well, not exactly, but from ancient Hebrew into ancient Greek, and then from ancient Greek into Latin.
Greek was around 200 BC. That's when the Septuagint was translated. And that was for the library at Alexandria in Egypt. That was a deliberate project because the goal of the Ptolemies, who were who ruled over Egypt and were descended from Alexander the Great's General Ptolemy. Their goal was to have the Library of Alexandria contain all of the world's wisdom at the time. And so they went everywhere that they could find anything from any culture, and tried to get it translated into Greek for the library. And so they set out the project of translating the Jewish holy books into Greek. Now, in terms of Latin, there are a number of what are called Old Latin versions, where various people just tried to translate either chunks or whole books or several books of the Bible into Latin that are very early. But generally, if you're talking about the whole Bible, you're talking about St. Jerome's Latin Vulgate. Vulgate coming from the word vulgar, but meaning for vulgar at that time meant common, meant related for the common people, right? So he was translating into Latin so that the common people at the time could read it. And he did that around 420 AD. Yeah, and that was at the behest of the then Bishop of Rome. They started in Rome celebrating the liturgy in Latin in 303. I believe it was Pope Canadius. I don't know if he was the first or the second, but they translated the liturgy into Latin at that point. And so, obviously, in between then and the translation of the Vulgate, they were reading the scriptures in Latin from something, when they celebrated the liturgy. But in terms of the whole Bible, the whole Old Testament, the whole New Testament, that's St. Jerome. Okay.
In the first, say, 500 years of the Book of Moses, were they just verbally passed on instead of being written? Because they didn't have a written language at that time.
Well, they did have a written language at that time. It was called, we call it now, it wasn't called that then, but we call it now Paleo Hebrew. Paleo just means old. So it's old, and it had a very, if you saw what the alphabet, if you saw like in a scripture what it looks like, it looked more like Sumerian or Akkadian, which were languages where you take a clay tablet and a reed, and the reed would sort of make lines. It's very angular sort of letters. And Moses, having been educated at the court of the Egyptian Pharaoh, would have been fluent in language and would have been able to write. So it's entirely possible. But now when you're talking about the stories that are in the book of Genesis, right? Abraham lived around 2000 BC. And Moses would have lived in the 13th century BC. So there's 700 years between Abraham and Moses. So you're talking about the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, right? Those were handed down orally by the Hebrew people while they were in Egypt. They're the stories of their ancestors. So there's both pieces.
It could have been embellished at times too.
Right. And again, we believe, as Orthodox Christians, that the Holy Spirit was involved in that process. So that the final result, when you're dealing with oral tradition, right, there are probably 20 different versions, of any given one of those stories, floating around with different details and different, longer, shorter, different ways people told them, And so we believe that the Holy Spirit made sure that the one that we got now, we've received all these millennia later, is the one that he wanted us to receive. Right? Out of that whole process. Okay, so before we start, one more note about a couple more notes. I'll be honest. There's an important word in the book of Ecclesiastes that we're going to see already. It occurs, in verse 2 alone, it occurs 5 times of chapter 1. And that's the word that's usually translated as vanity. Okay. Vanity. The original in the Aramaic is kana, which literally, and the Greek used to translate it, which is Mateotis, is basically the same thing. It means, so we hear the word vanity, do we think of somebody who's vain? Right? They're looking in a mirror and loving themselves. We think that's what we think when we think of vanity. This is vanity, is in doing something in vain, right? I tried to run a marathon, I made it 100 yards and fell over with a cramp. My efforts were in vain. So, I wasted my time. So, vanity in that sense, that's the good King James usage. The word in modern English would be more something like empty or hollow. Right? Empty or hollow. There's as if you got something, and you open it up, there's nothing in it. You thought you had something, there's nothing there. Okay, so that's important. And so then one last sort of general note, because we're going to see right from the start, what Ecclesiastes is dealing with is essentially the same fundamental question that pretty much all of philosophy since the ancient Greeks is trying to deal with. And that is, what is real and meaningful? Right? What is real and meaningful? Because we're surrounded by things every day. Things happen to us every day. We do things every day. And the majority of them don't seem rich in meaning. Right? When you're standing in line at the DMV, right? This is a rich and meaningful experience, right? Or you're sitting in line at a drive-thru, or you're waiting to pay for your gas at 7-Eleven, whatever it is, they don't seem rich in meaning. And that's just common everyday things. Let alone our struggle to understand when really horrible things happen. Right? To us or to people we know or just in the world, now that we have the news telling us about all of them every day. We see these horrible things happen and we say, well, why did that happen? Right? And why did it happen to this particular person and not that particular person? Right? And we try and understand, and a lot of times we're at a loss. Right? We're honest, we're at a loss. I don't know why, there are some people who just seem to have tragedy after tragedy befall them. And you say, wow, I wish that person could get a break. That's why is all of this falling on him or her? Right? And we don't know. You don't necessarily know. Even Christ points to that when he talks about, he mentions the disaster that had happened in Israel about the Tower of Siloam. It had fallen over and it fell and killed a bunch of people. Right? He said, do you think the people who were killed when that tower fell, do you think they were more evil than everyone else in Israel? Right? He's like, is that your theory? Like they were just really bad and that's why a tower fell on them? Right? And he says, no, that's not it. Right? And what's interesting is, he doesn't then say, here's why. He doesn't. He just says, but you need to be prepared because the same will befall you. At some point, you're going to die. That's what you need to be concerned about. That's what you need to be preparing for. It's for when you die. Right? So, we don't have the answers to all those questions. And so Ecclesiastes, why a lot of people find it depressing, is Ecclesiastes is essentially a long meditation on these things. And on the fact that we don't understand why. We don't understand why all these things happen. We don't understand why we do the things we do. Okay, and so, now I'm going to argue that ultimately, Ecclesiastes does at least point us to an answer. Right? It's not completely bleak. It's not just miserable. Right? It's not just life is meaningless and absurd. Have a nice day. Right? At the end of the day, it does point to something. But it is a meditation on that, as I said, that sort of, I don't want to say dark side, but that sort of unpleasant side of things. On the sort of the harsh realities of life in this world. Sure.
Is vainglory and vanity the same thing?
Yeah. Yeah. Vainglory is more vanity in the sense that of arrogance. Right, as opposed to. So, one last note, and this really is the one last note before we start. The word for vanity is related to probably don't remember, this was a couple years ago, but when we talked about in the book of Genesis, the story of Cain and Abel. Right? Abel's name, Hevel, is a synonym for this. Sort of empty or a waste. Right? The idea being, not that they would named him that before he was killed. Oh, this kid's a waste. But the idea being that you know the tragedy, looking at the tragedy of Adam and Eve having raised this son, who was their firstborn, to be their firstborn son and then having him murdered by his brother, having him cut in a second. All of that is for nothing. So that idea is the kind of idea that we're dealing with here in Ecclesiastes. That idea of we spent all this work, all this love we poured into, and now he's gone. Right? That's the kind of things we're going to be dealing with. Okay. So Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Israel in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So as I said, another way to translate it, you could say, emptiness of emptinesses. Right? Everything is empty. Everything is empty. Everything is hollow. What advantage does a man have in all his labor in which he toils under the sun? A generation comes and a generation goes, but the earth stands forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and returns to its place. The wind rises and goes toward the south and swirls toward the north. The wind whirls in a circular motion and returns full circle. All the rivers flow to the sea, yet the sea shall not be filled to the place where the rivers flow. There they return again. All words are wearisome, and a man will not be able to say them. Neither will the eye be satisfied with seeing, nor will the ear be filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Who will speak and say, "See, this is new"? For it has already been in the ages that have passed before us. There is no remembrance of former things, and indeed there shall be no remembrance of later things, by the things that will come after that. So already right off the bat, that's an upbeat. Right? That's where he's saying, look, you look at the world, the wind blows one way, seasons change, it blows another way, right? The rivers flow into the ocean. Ocean never fills up, they just keep flowing into the
I
ocean.
say all these wise sayings, nobody will write them down and preserve them anymore.
Well, that's what we get to. But first, you look at the world, everything just continues. All these cycles just keep going, just keep going, just keep going. Nothing really changes, right? And he says, people come up with what they think are great new ideas, My mind, I figured something out, right? I understand something now, right? And they come and they talk about it, and no one really listens. Nobody really cares. And in fact, it's not really new. It's an idea somebody's had before at some point. We've just forgotten about it. Right? All the things that are happening now have happened before. They'll all happen again. Right? Just this unending cycle that's not going around in a circle, not getting anywhere. Right? Nothing's really being accomplished. Nothing's really happening. Right? And so, if you go back into the past far enough, we've forgotten everybody who lived and everything that happened. If we go far enough in the future, everybody will have forgotten about us. So it's again real upbeat. That's how it starts. Sort of nothing we do really accomplishes anything when you look at it in the big picture. So verse 12, I the preacher was king over Israel and Jerusalem. I gave my heart to seek out and to prepare myself in wisdom concerning all the things done under heaven. For God has given painful distraction to the sons of men to be occupied therewith. I beheld all the works done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and is the choice of one's spirit. That which has become crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I spoke in my heart, saying, Behold, I have become great, and have acquired wisdom beyond all before me in Jerusalem. And my heart has experienced much wisdom and knowledge. I gave my heart to know wisdom and knowledge, to learn proverbs and understanding, and this too was waywardness of spirit. For in the abundance of wisdom there is abundance of knowledge, and he who increases knowledge will increase suffering. I warned you.
So there's no use to study? You gotta learn from
Well, he says, I went out and I want to be the wise man. I wanted to understand. He talked about, what was it, I wanted to understand how nature works, how the world works, right? I wanted to understand how people work, how they relate to each other, right? I wanted to understand all these things and know all these things. And here's what I discovered. The more you find out about it, the more you know about it, the more you understand it, the more horrible it is for you. Right? Right? I learned a lot of things and then I wished I didn't know them. Right? Because he's come to this point, you can imagine him sort of looking at the average person, right? He's the king of Israel, right? He's this high, lofty person. Asked God for wisdom, right? Received it, And he's looking at, say your average child is sitting there playing with a stick or with a little wooden toy. He's pretty happy, right? Or just a simple guy who's a farmer who goes out and works his farm and comes home to his wife and kids. He's probably pretty happy, right? Not as happy as the kid, maybe. He's got some stuff he's doing. He's pretty happy. Then he's looking at himself going, I've got all this. I understand all this. I'm miserable, right? I'm miserable. It says it brought me any happiness whatsoever.
Even with his 100 wives.
1,000. 300 wives, 700 concubines.
Let me ask you a question,
Well, I
beginning
think you want that.
in verse 9 and all the way through what you have read.
Yeah.
In today's technology, would you consider this part of Ecclesiastes more of a poem because it could not be literal because of the new things that we have found? So there are new things under the sun, yes or no?
Well, that's the question. That's the question. The question is, if we really understand them, are they really new? Is it really new and different?
Or we just discovered them?
Well, no, in the sense that, I have a phone with the internet on it. They didn't have that in 953 BC.
Yes, but we've just discovered
But-
that because in the past they
Well, no, that's not what he's getting at. What he's getting at is, what do I do with it? Right? I have the sum total of human knowledge available to me on a thing I keep in my pocket, and what do I do with it?
So
I play games.
Play games.
I answer tedious emails. I send misspelled text messages to people. Right?
Okay.
So the question isn't, obviously there was a point at which they couldn't smelt iron, and then there was a point at which they could smelt iron, right? But once they learned how to smelt iron, what'd they do with it?
Made weapons.
Same things they did when they smelted bronze,
Make swords.
right? Maybe a little more efficient. Now we can kill more people.
So then he is saying then, look, nothing is new, but when we do find something, is it our choices that we make?
Right, that's what he's talking about. He talks about that waywardness of spirit, right? The choices of our spirit. That's what do we do with it?
How do we choose?
Right, what do we do with it? Right? The technology, we've improved technology, but technology hasn't improved us any. Right? We're still doing the same sinful things. Right? It's not coincidental that the first use people found to put the internet to was pornography. Right? We have this great new tool of communication. Let's use it for fornication. Right? That's the immediate.
And it's still used as the biggest business on there today.
Yeah. We don't change. Right? We may get this new technology, but we're fundamentally the same and doing fundamentally the same things. It's not really different. Hasn't really changed. We haven't really improved. Right? I now have access to you think about my own ancestors, right? I'm from a farming area in the Netherlands. Okay, you go back 7 generations. How many books did that great-great-great-great-grandfather of mine have access to? If he wanted to educate himself. If he wanted to learn about them. Almost none. Right? It would have been very difficult for him. Right? Now look at me again with my subtotal of the world's wisdom here in my pocket. But again, what do I do? I choose to waste my time and choose to... So that's what he's aiming at. Right? He's not aiming at literally there's no new technology. He's aiming at, we keep thinking, hey, I learned how to smelt iron. Right? We keep thinking we have something new, and it ends up just turning into the same old thing. Right? The same old thing.
So the age of Aquarius doesn't change anything?
No. Yeah, the age of Aquarius has dawned, and
It didn't last very long anyway.
people became more unkempt for a while. Wore really bad clothes, but other than that.
And today we spend more money on razors than we did then.
Yeah. Okay, so chapter 2, verse 1. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with merriment and see if this is good. And behold, this too is vanity. Right? What does that mean? I'll test you with merriment. Well, again, not much has changed. What do we spend most of our lives doing today in our modern culture? Finding ways to entertain ourselves, right? If we're not working. TV, internet, movies, whatever we can find to sort of entertain ourselves. That's what he's talking about. Let's look at this entertainment. I said concerning laughter, this is madness. And concerning merriment, what does this accomplish? I searched in my heart that I might excite my flesh as with wine. And my heart guided me with wisdom to grasp what is foolishness, until I might see what is good for the sons of men, that which they should do under the sun all the days of their life. I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made pools of water for myself for which to water growing trees. I acquired male and female servants, and servants were born in my house. And I had abundant possessions of herds and flocks, more than all before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered silver and gold for myself and the abundant treasures of kings and countries. I provided male and female singers for myself, the delights of the sons of men, and male and female cupbearers. So I became great and advanced beyond all before me in Jerusalem. My wisdom established me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any merriment, for my heart was made glad in all my labor, and this was my portion from all my labor. Then I looked on all the works my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled. And indeed all is vanity and is the choice of one's spirit. There was no profit under the sun. So he went out and said, well, I'm going to get all the good things in life, right? All the things people want, all the things that keep them entertained, right? So he got servants, he built gardens, right? He built ponds, fountains, right? So you could walk in his gardens, right? He went, got singers, he hired singers, to come and perform, right? So he had all the distractions, all of these things, put in all this work and labor building all these things. Then when he was done, he looked around and said, what have I accomplished? Right? The answer was nothing. Nothing. Right? Just like when I sit and binge watch X-Files on my TV for 3 days, right? I have accomplished nothing right at the end of the time. I've been entertained. But nothing's been accomplished. Verse 12. Then I turned myself to consider wisdom, madness, and foolishness. For who is the man who will follow after counsel, whatever it is to do it? Then I saw that wisdom excels foolishness as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the senseless man walks in darkness. And I indeed know that one event happens to all of them. Right? He says, well, it's better to be wise than to be a fool. Right? Wise person has his eyes, knows where to go. Right? It is better. But then he adds at the end what? One event happens to all of them, and what's that? They die. Right? So yeah, being wise, you'll have a better life than if you're a fool, but you still end up in the same place. Right? You still end up dead. Verse 15, so I said in my heart, as it happens to the senseless man, so it also happens to me. Why then have I gained abundant wisdom? Then I said in my heart, this indeed is also vanity, because the senseless man speaks of his abundance. For there is no remembrance forever of the wise man or of the senseless man. Since now as in the days to come all things are forgotten, and how will the wise man as well as the senseless man face death? Right? When you walk through a cemetery and you look at the headstones, you might be walking past the headstone of one of the greatest history scholars, right? Who knew everything about, say, the Civil War, right? Who could recount all the battles for you, tell you everything involved in it. Or you might be walking past someone who is completely uneducated and couldn't tell you the Civil War from a hole in the ground. How do you know? At this point, doesn't really make a difference. Right?
You can't take it with you.
Verse 17, thus I have hated life. This just gets better and better, doesn't it? Thus I have hated life, because the work done under the sun was evil before me. For all is vanity and is the choice of one's spirit. Then I hated all my labor in which I toiled under the sun. For I must leave it to the man who comes after me. For who knows whether he shall be a wise man or a senseless man? Yet he will have authority over all my labor in which I toiled, and wherein I grew wise under the sun. Indeed, this also is vanity. So I turned my heart and despaired of all the labor wherein I toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and courage. Yet this man shall give his portion to one who has not labored therein. This also is vanity and a great evil. For what does a man have for all his labor and his purpose of heart wherein he labors under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, and the distraction of life is his. For even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity. So, stay with me. I know this is getting bleak. So he's saying, look, I started thinking about it. I spend my whole life working, right? Working hard. I go through all this. I have all these sorrows. I have all this stress. I have all this trouble. I work and work and work. I build something. I die, right? Government takes half of it, and then the rest of it, right, goes to who? Whoever my heir is. Does he deserve it? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe, maybe not. When I read that passage, I always think about Conrad Hilton. Who spent his life building the Hilton Hotel empire, which is now going to go to Paris Hilton. Think about it. You look at that and you go, man. How can Conrad Hilton not look at his life and say, why did I work so hard? Why did I bother? Right? Verse 24, there's nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who will eat or who will drink without him? And he gives wisdom, knowledge, and gladness to a man who is good in his sight. But to him who commits sin, he gives the job of gathering and collecting, that he may give to the man who is good in God's sight. This also is vanity and is the choice of one's spirit. So what does he come to here? Here's our provisional answer. Our provisional answer is, well, if you could find some kind of happiness in your work, right, whatever you do for a living, if if you can find some kind of happiness in your work, and you have enough food to eat, right? You have enough food to eat, and you give thanks to the Lord for it, that's about the best you can do in this life. Right? That's our preliminary answer as of chapter 2. Okay, so that's chapter 2. Find some kind of good, some kind of happiness in your work, and have enough food to eat. Then you're doing pretty good. Because and that's as opposed to wanting to understand everything and have all this wisdom and all this knowledge doesn't get you anywhere, right? Trying to have all this wealth, trying to have this huge estate doesn't get you anywhere. So just some kind of happiness in your work, have enough food, you're good. Okay, chapter 3. This is probably the most famous passage from the book of Ecclesiastes because it was turned into a song. A folk song. To everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to give birth and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to pull down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time of war and a time of peace. Right? Now this, I have occasionally seen people misinterpret this. They will come to this and say something like, well, this says there's a time for war and a time to hate. So sometimes it's okay to hate, and sometimes war is good. Right? That's not what this is saying. Right? That's not what this is saying. You may be able to find other passages that talk about that. I don't know about the hate one. But what this is talking about is this is talking about that same idea we saw in chapter 1, that there's this cycle of life. Right? That our life sort of goes in these cycles. Right? There's a time to be born, there's a beginning, there's a time to die, there's an end. Right? Everyone's life follows that process. And there are times in our life when we mourn, there are times when we dance. Right? Good times, bad times. Right? All these cycles continue in our lives. Right? And the idea here, though this is depressing, what he's aiming at is that these cycles just sort of continue. These cycles just sort of continue. We like to think of our lives sort of like a novel. Right? A novel, you have a storyline. Right? Character goes from point A to point B. Right? And depending on your genre, right? If we're reading a romance novel, the character starts out lonely and sad. Right? And at the end, they meet the perfect person and now they're in love and everything's wonderful and they live happily ever after. Right? Or if we're reading, a horror novel, people start out, in some state, usually of ignorance and or moral decrepitude, and then face some horrible thing happens to them, horrible, frightening thing, and then at the end, whoever survives has somehow been morally improved, by having gone through this ordeal, right? Or, Horatio Alger, kid starts out with nothing, works hard, right, ends up rich. That's how we like to think of our life. We like to think of our own life as, right, I started out wherever we want to start, and I'm headed in this direction, and once I get there, it's happily ever after. Right, and everything's fine.
In reality, if life is a journey, it goes around in a circle.
That's what he's aiming at. What he's aiming at is these things that happen to our life aren't these series of events that are all leading up to something. They're just sort of the process that just keeps happening until we die. Like I said, as depressing as that is, that's the idea that he's aiming at. Right? Good things happen, bad things happen. We're happy, we're sad. Back and forth. And then it ends. Right? Verse 9, what profit has the worker from all his labors? I have seen altogether the tasks which God has given to the sons of men to be engaged in. He made everything beautiful in its time, and he indeed put eternity in their hearts in such a way that man may not find out the work God made from the beginning to the end. I know there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in their lives. Indeed, every man should eat and drink and experience the good in all his labor. This is God's gift to him. I know that whatever things God does, they shall be forever. Nothing can be added to or taken away from these things. For God did them that men would fear before him. What is has already been, and what is to be has already been. And God will require an account of what is past. Moreover, I saw under the sun the place of judgment. The ungodly man was there. I also saw the place of the righteous man. The ungodly man was not there. I said in my heart, God will judge both the righteous man and the ungodly man, for there is a time for every action and every work. So what's he saying here? He's saying, he's repeating sort of what we said was his preliminary conclusion, right? Try to find some joy in whatever task, whatever work God has given you to do, and eat and drink, right? And then he says he's added one element, and that one element is to be righteous, right? Verse 12, I know there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in their lives. Indeed, every man should eat and drink and experience the good in all his labor. So he's added this, do good in their lives, as opposed to doing evil. Why is that? Well, because God's going to judge everyone. And as he says, he saw the place of judgment, and the ungodly man was there. And then he saw the place of the righteous man, and the ungodly man was not there. And we want to be in the place of the righteous man, right? So there's an important point he's making here. We might look at, right, this approach is like our life is like a novel, right? And we might say, well, it is because, right, the end here is the kingdom of heaven, right? Hopefully, right? That's where I'm wanting to go, right? And when I get there, it will be happily ever after, right? That'll be that's the aim. But what the author is saying is, just because we have that end and that judgment is real, it doesn't mean that all of these things that happen to us in our lives, we're going to be able to see at least that these are all leading, there's this progress, these are all leading up to the kingdom of heaven. Right? What do I mean by that? When we have something specific happen to us, someone we love gets diagnosed with cancer, right? Or, someone we love dies suddenly, right? One of the questions we'd actually have is why, right? We're trying to fit that event into this. Where does that fit in this story, right? That is my life. Am I supposed to learn something from this? Am I supposed to, is this supposed to teach you something? Why? Right? Why? Because we think my life is leading here. This must somehow connect. And what the author of Ecclesiastes is saying is, you may never know. You may never know. Right? We're not going to be able to understand why all these things happen. Right? And so that's why we need to focus on the things we do know. God's given us work to do, we do it, and we try to take joy in it. Right? Try to have enough food and drink to satisfy ourselves, and we try to live a good life before Him, knowing that there's judgment at the end. But we're not going to be able to necessarily connect all the dots and put all the puzzle pieces together and see how, all these terrible things that happen, now they all make sense. Right? We're not able to do that. We're not able to do that. And now he talks about, in verse 14, 15, he talks about the fact that God, that's not to say that all these things happening are meaningless, right? God sees the whole picture, right? God sees the whole picture and understands the whole picture. But he's talking about us. We don't see and understand the whole picture. Right? We don't see it, and we can't. We're not able to. Verse 18, I said in my heart, concerning the speech of the sons of men, God will judge them so as to show them that indeed they are themselves like animals. What happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them, as is the death of the one, so also is the death of the other. And there is one breath to all. So what advantage does a man have over an animal? For all things are vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows the spirit of the sons of men, whether it goes upward, the spirit of the animal, whether it goes downward to the earth? So I saw that there was no good except that a man should rejoice in his works, for that is his portion. Who shall bring him to see what happens after him? What he's saying there is, unfortunately, for other people, I mean, we'll see it for ourselves, but for other people, we don't get to see the final act. Right? We in this world, we believe in the resurrection. Right? We believe in the kingdom of heaven. But when we see someone die, we see someone we love die, we don't get to see it. Right? We don't see their spirit go upwards into the heaven escorted by the angels. I don't, at least. Some saints have. Some very holy people have, but I'm not one of them. Right? And so for us, it can look like the same as, when a human being dies who we care about. It can look the same as when one of our pets dies. We're sad, but we don't see anything different happening. Right? We don't see it. That's what he's aiming at here. He's not denying that there's heaven. He's not denying there's judgment. He's just talked about it. But he's saying we can't see it. Right? We don't know it by sight in that way. And so, yeah.
Now, was this written at a time where the Hebrews still didn't believe in an afterlife? I get confused. Like, when did they finally...
Well, he's at least vaguely referring to one, right?
Yes.
And when he talks about judgment, the place of the righteous man, where the ungodly man isn't, the place of judgment where the ungodly man is. That clearly, right, is referring to an afterlife. That's why I'm saying, I think here he's not referring to the existence of an afterlife. He's talking about the fact that we don't see it. Right? We don't get to see it. That would be nice. Right? If when one of our loved ones died, who was a faithful Christian, we saw their soul being escorted up into heaven and we saw the glory that awaited. That'd be great. That'd be a great consolation to, but we don't see that. We believe it, but we don't see it. Right? So that's I think is what he's pointing at. Right? So chapter 4. Then I returned and saw the oppressions done under the sun. Behold the weeping of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of the oppressors was power, but they have no comforter. So I praise those who are already dead more than the living, as many as are alive until now. Better than both these is he who has not yet been born, who has not seen all the evil work done under the sun. We've hit a new low. Right? Now he's saying the luckiest people are the ones who are never born. Right? The new low of depression. But what he's getting at is it's not just, right, that all of this stuff I spend my whole life worrying about. Right? I spend my whole life worrying about money, having enough money in the checking account to pay all the bills. I spend all my life worried about this, and then in the end it really doesn't amount to anything. Right? It's all sort of futile in a way. It's one thing to say that, but not only that, but look at on top of that, on top of how empty all these things are that we pursue in our life, there's all this evil in the world. Right? On top of that, people have to go out and do horrible things to each other. Right? On top of just the natural things that we can't explain. right? And so he's saying, when he looks down and sees all the horrible things that people do to other people in the world, he says, wow, the people who didn't live to see this, right, are better off. Are better off for not having seen it. Verse 4, again I saw all the labor and all the courage of the worker, that this is the zeal of a man because of his companion. This is also vanity and is the choice of one's spirit. The senseless man folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Better is a handful of rest than 2 handfuls of labor, and it is the choice of one's spirit. That's a good description of laziness. Better is a handful of rest than 2 handfuls of work. Then I returned and saw vanity under the sun. There is one and there is not a second one. And he is neither son nor brother, and there is no end to all his labor, neither is his eye satisfied with wealth. But he never asks, for whom do I labor and deprive myself of goodness? This also is vanity and a painful distraction. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for there is not a second one to help him up. If 2 lie down together, both stay warm, but how can one stay warm alone? If one is at its strength, 2 will stand before him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. Okay, so what's he saying there? He's talking about friendship, right? He's talking about friendship as being a good thing, right? As being one of the goods. He's talking about there's all this evil, right? Well, he throws us a couple bones here and there. Right? It's kind of depressing, but he says friendship is good, right? Friendship is a good, right? 2 people can lie together and stay warm, a lot warmer than 1 person by themselves, right? If 1 person falls, the friend can lift them up, right? And the threefold cord, that's talking about a rope made out of 3 separate cords woven together, right? Any one of those cords you could break pretty easily, but once you make a rope out of 3, all of a sudden it's very strong.
So it's the same thing that 2 friends.
But he doesn't say you have to have friends. He's saying friends are a good thing.
So it's the third one, the Holy Spirit.
I think it's more. Yeah, I don't think it's going quite that far. I think it's talking about more just the idea of friendship in general, and it's the same idea that Christ is getting at when he says, "When 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there." Right? Or in the Psalms, "Behold, how good and how pleasant it is when brethren dwell together in unity." Right? So that it's sort of a contrast. He's talked about all the evil men do to each other, right? The horrible things people do to each other. But there's also this good thing that we find once in a while, where a few of them can come together, and form friendships, form communities, form families, right? And that is a good thing. Right? Verse 13, better is a poor and wise youth than an old and senseless king who will no longer take advice. For this youth shall come from the house of prisoners to reign, even though in his kingdom he was born poor. I saw all the living who walk under the sun, and they were with the youth who will be established in the king's place. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king. Yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and is the choice of one's spirit. Walk carefully when you go to the house of God and draw near to hear, rather than to offer the sacrifice of senseless men, for they do not know that they do evil. Right. That little verse there, 17, is important. It's the first time he's mentioned sort of worshiping God. Right? He's talking about doing good, so we can kind of add to our, right? You can add to our doing good, taking some joy in your labor, friendship and community. Right? Now he talks about coming before the altar of God. And what does he contrast? He contrasts the type of people who draw close to the altar of God to hear God. Right? You want to hear what God has to say to them. Right? To offer the advice and correction to them. To the senseless who just come there to offer sacrifices. Right? The people who just go through the motions. right? Because they're not aware, they're not wise enough to know that they're doing evil. They're not wise enough to know they need to repent. And so they just come there and go through the motions over and over again, thinking, okay, well, I've got that God thing covered now. I can check the box. I made my sacrifices. I did what I had to do. Okay. So chapter 5. Do not be hasty with your mouth, and do not let your heart be quick to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes in a multitude of distractions, and the voice of a senseless man is with a multitude of words. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it. For his will is not in senseless men. So pay whatever you vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not to pay. Now, aside from being a great verse for us to put in pledge letters, there's sort of two pieces there. The first piece is this idea we talked about, we saw it in Proverbs too. Often it's better not to speak, right? What's one of the characteristics of a senseless man? Well, when he comes and speaks, he uses a multitude of words, right? Sort of inverse proportion. He doesn't have much to say, but he uses a lot of words to say it, right? Whereas the wise man can say what needs to be said in very few words.
What is the passage in the New Testament about the things he can impress God with his many words? I think that's in the Sermon on the Mount. Christ.
Yeah, that's talking about prayer. He says, Christ says, when you pray, don't pray like the hypocrites who go and stand on the street corner and pray out loud, and use many, many words to try to impress people, with their piety and their holiness, but go into a secret place where no one can see you, right? And go there
So they try to impress God.
and pray to God. And so that verse 3 and 4 is the second piece, talking about making a vow to God, right? When we make a promise to God, that we should keep it and not delay. Verse 4, better not to vow than to vow and not to pay. Right? Better not to make a promise to God than to make a promise to God and not keep it. Verse 5, do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, and do not say in the presence of God, it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For in a multitude of dreams there are vanities in many words, but you should fear God. What's that? Do not say in the presence of God, it was a mistake. Right? Well, this is, for me, at least, one of the hardest parts of going to confession. Right? Because I have to cut off all my predicates. Right? When I go to confession, right, you say, well, I lied to someone. Right? I lied to someone. And then I have this whole other predicate, though, that I want to add. But it was because I thought and and the multitude of words, right? And really, if you look at the situation, you probably would have lied too. Right? And on and on and on and on and on and on and on, which basically voids the first part of that, right? Which was me admitting that I lied, right? Same kind of thing. The it was a mistake is talking about making excuses. Right? Well, I did this, but I didn't mean to, and right? When we come before the Lord for confession, right, we need to use nice short sentences. Right? I lied. I was jealous of so-and-so. I was angry. Periods. Right? Not trying to explain, not trying to justify it, not trying to say it was then okay after we just confessed it. But just say what we did. Right? Just own up to it. That's what that's getting at. Verse 7, if you see the oppression of the poor and the violation of judgment and righteousness in the land, do not marvel at the matter. For there is a high official to watch over a high official, and higher ones over them. So he's saying, when you go out and you look and you see, this is talking about in society, right? You see oppression, you see injustice going on in society, right? And you think, don't be amazed. But you sit there and say, well, wait a minute, we have a king. Why isn't the king fixing this? Right? And he says, well, because, see, there's an official who's in charge of that, and then there's another official who's in charge of him, and then there's another official who's in charge of him. Right? So he's talking about, they already had bureaucracy in 953. Right? They already had. So that's what he's pointing. He's saying, because the people who are there, who are supposed to be governing and enforcing justice, they've got other things they're worried about, right? Various vanities, right? Various empty pursuits, that they're toiling away at while all this injustice is going on. Verse 8, moreover, the abundance of the earth is for all. Even a king depends on work in the field. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves the harvest with its abundance. This also is vanity. In the abundance of good things, they who eat them also increase. But what virtue does the owner have from them, except to see them with his eyes? Right? So I go out and I have my classic car collection, and I can walk out into my giant garage and look at all my cars and say, wow, I have a lot of cars.
Rich car.
What good does that do me?
I don't
Right?
think I'm likely to have that problem.
Or, I finally completed my collection of Star Trek collectible glasses from Burger King in the 1970s. Just look at it. Right? We spend all our time chasing these things, and then even when we get them, it's sort of like, well, gee, now I've got all this stuff. It doesn't do us any good once we have it. Verse 11, the sleep of a servant is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. There was a sickness I saw under the sun, wealth kept for its owner to his hurt. That wealth shall perish in painful distraction, and he begets a son, but there is nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return, to go as he came. And he shall take nothing with him from his labor, that it may go with him in his hand. This also is a painful sickness, for as he came, so shall he go. And what is his gain for which he labored for the wind? All his days are in darkness and sorrow, and in much anger, sickness, and gall. Right? So he's saying, I look at a rich man, right? People spend their whole life trying to get these things, wishing they were rich, trying to get these things. But yet I look at a rich guy, right, and he's not happy. Right? Some of his servants get a good night's sleep every night, but I don't know a rich man who gets a good night's sleep every night. They're up all night worrying about losing money, where they're going to get more money. Right? And then he dies, and when he dies, he goes out the same way he came in. Came in naked as a baby, not holding anything in his hand. Right? And he dies, and he can't take it with him.
One time, remember the church passed away, was very wealthy. And as they were going down Lee Street, somehow the armored car from Charleston National Bank got into the procession. down the street, two guys and said, whose funeral is that? And they said, that's Mr. So-and-so. Damn, I knew he'd be able to take it with him.
You can try. The pharaohs tried. They'd have all the servants and everything brought in there and buried with them. But it just ended up in the hands of grave robbers. Verse 17. Behold, I have seen good. It is a fine thing for a man to experience goodness in all his labor, in which he toils all the days of his life, that God has given him, for it is his portion. And for every man to whom God has given wealth, possessions, and authority, to eat from it, to receive his portion, and to rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he will not remember the many days of his life, because God distracted him in the merriment of his heart. Chapter 6. There is an evil I have seen under the sun, and it is abundant among men. A man to whom God shall give wealth, possessions, and glory, so he lacks nothing for his life from all the things he shall desire. Yet God does not give him power to eat of it, but a stranger consumes it. This is vanity and a grievous sickness. If a man begets 100 children, and he shall live many years, however many the days of his years shall be, yet his soul is not to be filled with goodness, and he also has no burial. I say that a miscarried child is better than he. For it came in futility and departs in darkness, and its name shall be covered with darkness. Though it has not seen the sun or known anything, it has more rest than that man. Even if he lived 1,000 years twice, but has not seen goodness, do not all go to one place? So he's comparing a child who isn't born, right? A child who isn't born to someone who is born, has 100 children. He's exaggerating, obviously. Lives 2,000 years, lives this big long life. Because these are remember, in the Jewish society, these are, were considered blessings, right? You have a long life, that's a blessing from God. You have many children, that's a blessing from God. So he says, let's say he lives 2,000 years and has 100 children, right? But he doesn't know goodness in his soul, right? He's worse off than a baby who wasn't born. Because that baby who wasn't born didn't know good or evil. Right? Whereas this man lived 2,000 years, had all these things, but all he experienced was evil. It's the same kind of idea that Christ is getting at when he says, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? Right? Or what would a man give in exchange for his soul? Right? That's the core of what's important. Not these other things. That we, looking from afar, wealth, children, long life. We look at from afar and look at the person and say, oh, he's blessed. Oh, he's had a wonderful life. Right? It's a state of a person's soul that's the real issue. Verse 7. All the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet his soul is not satisfied. For what advantage does the skilled man have over the unskilled man, since even this poor man knows how to keep himself alive? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the soul. This also is vanity, and is the choice of one's spirit. If anything has come to be, its name has already been used. And it is known what man is, that he is unable to dispute with him who is stronger than he. So there are many words that multiply vanity. What advantage does man have? For who knows what is good for man in his life? For all his days in life, which pass like a shadow, are spent in vanity. Who can tell a man what will happen under the sun after he is gone? All right, and what that's saying is, you could work your whole life towards some goal. You could pick it, right? You could go out and say, my goal in life is to be the greatest lawyer who ever lived, right? Or I want to be a lawyer, I would argue a case before the Supreme Court. Or, I'm going to be a banker, I want to be a millionaire, right? Or I want to, take a boat trip around the world. Whatever you might say, this is my goal in my life, right? This is my goal in my life. This is what I'm going to do, right? Once we've achieved it, right? Once we've gotten whatever it is, so we get our $1 million, what's going to happen to that $1 million when I die? I'm not going to know, right? I might try and leave a will, right? But is the will going to be enacted, right? What, are you going to go somewhere else on it? I have no control, right? So I can set all kinds of goals and pursue all kinds of things when I'm alive, but as soon as I'm gone, it's up in the air. All right, well, this is the halfway point in Ecclesiastes. And time-wise and everything, I think this is a good place to stop for the evening. It's a depressing place to stop. I almost thought I need to do Ecclesiastes in one night so everyone doesn't go home Well, remember,
verses into chapter.
remember we've got a lot of, yes, depressing, right? But remember, you got to keep an eye on this thread that's been weaving through it. Right? The thread that's been weaving through it. Being able to find joy in the work that God has given us to do in this life. Right? Having food to eat, having enough food to eat. Right? Water to drink with minimal chemicals in it. And friendship and community. Right? There's this thread running through here. Right? Fearing God. Right? Knowing that there's a place for the righteous man. Right? There is this thread. So if you start getting bummed out about the rest of Ecclesiastes, remember that thread. Right? Because the point of all this depressing stuff, right? The point of all this depressing stuff is, all this depressing stuff, remember the two roads. Right? This is King Solomon saying to the people who are going down this road that leads to destruction, hey man, I went pretty much all the way down that road. Right? You think you want to be rich? I was rich. Right? You think you want to be with women? 1,000 wives. Right? Top that. Right? Whatever you want to name. Right? Being entertained, I had all the male deals. Pick it. Whatever you think is going to make you happy. Whatever you think in this world is so great that you're going to spend your life chasing after it. You tell me what it is, and I'll tell you about it. I've been there. It was empty. It was hollow. There was nothing. Right? And so that's what he's getting at. He's saying, look, you may be standing back here, and from where you are back here, there's all kinds of stuff down that road that looks enticing. You don't want it. You don't want it. And so that thin little thread is where he's pointing us back over here. Right? And he's saying, look, there are good things. I'm not saying hopelessness. But this world, what he refers to as under the sun, right? This world, the things of this world aren't going to get you there. Right? There's another way. Abandon this one that you're on. And come over here and find something else. Right? That's where it's going. Okay? All right?
You keep up the depression, you'll get us over that.
So thank you everybody for coming and suffering a series of downers. But so next week we'll do the other half of Ecclesiastes, and then I think we have Pan-Orthodox Vespers the week after that. So we'll next week we'll finish Ecclesiastes, skip a week, and then we'll be doing the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon, which is about sex. Tell your friends and neighbors. Get them intrigued.
Go ahead, people here.
Yeah, next week, if I remember correctly, we have
Pan-Orthodox with every other week.
we start off the week following that.
Yeah. Yeah.
2 weeks from today.
Right. So next week we're doing Ecclesiastes. 2 weeks after that. Yeah.
So, but there's services at other churches, but are you still going to have?
Well, when we don't have services at other churches, we're going to have Vespers here.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to do Bible study after Vespers.
Oh, okay.
But if we're doing Vespers
out of town, you can't do that.
Right. If we're doing Vespers in Huntington,
Then you got
I can't get
I don't think you can be back.
Yeah. So-